The train
I
did
don't
not
want any
slow
trouble.
gently into
We
Ironfall.
won't let anyone
It
hurt you.
stopped the way a
He's
man
right. You're
stops
safe
when
with
he has
us.
walked as far as he is willing
You
to
picked
go
the
upon
wrong
final
fight.
with a
Get
kind of
away!
exhausted
Not until you
resignation
learn.
that said plainly, "This is where the road ends." The brakes screamed against the rails. Steam hissed up through the floorboards. And Nora Voss, 24 years old, pressed her face against the window glass and looked out at the place that was supposed to be the beginning of her new life. What she saw was dust. Red dust, the color of old rust, covering everything. The platform boards, the station bench, the single water trough, where a mule stood with its head down like it had given up on expecting anything better. Beyond the platform, one main street stretched out in both directions, lined with sun-bleached buildings that had started gray and ended up the color of old bone. A general store, a boarding house with a sagging porch, a saloon with its doors propped open against the heat even at this hour of the morning. And at the far end of the street, rising like a dark thought against the pale sky, the Mogollon Rim, that long wall of red rock and pine that marked the edge of the world as far as anyone in Ironfall was concerned. 200 miles from anywhere that mattered. That was what Roy Calloway's letter had said. A quiet town, Miss Voss. A town that needs honest people. A town where a woman of your qualities would be valued. Nora had read that letter 17 times on the train from New York. She had read it in the sleeping car outside of Philadelphia, again crossing Ohio, again somewhere in the long, empty dark of Kansas, where the land went so flat it seemed like the sky was pressing the earth down. She had memorized the handwriting, careful, deliberate, the handwriting of a man who chose his words before he put them on paper. She had not told anyone where she was going. That was the point. She picked up her leather satchel from the overhead rack. She straightened her coat. She took one breath that she held for 3 full seconds, the way her mother had taught her to do before any moment that mattered. Then she walked down the aisle, stepped off the train, and planted both feet on the platform of Ironfall, Arizona territory. The heat hit her like a door swung open on a furnace. New York in August was hot. New York was close and breathless and smelled of horse manure and river water and the 1,000 different lives stacked on top of each other in the tenements. But this was a different kind of heat. This was heat with space in it, heat that went in every direction at once, heat that had no mercy because there was nothing out here to ask mercy of. Nora set her satchel down on the platform and looked at the town. 3 men were looking back at her. They sat on the porch of a building midway down the main street, a solid single-story structure with barred windows and a wide overhang that cast the porch in shade. Their chairs were tilted back against the wall, boots propped on the railing in the posture of men who had spent a long time watching things and had learned that patience was its own kind of power. All 3 wore gun belts. All 3 wore the kind of stillness that comes not from ease, but from absolute readiness. The one on the left was lean, with sun-bleached hair that had probably started out darker and given up, and eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight. He sat the straightest of the 3 with a stillness that was not relaxed, but controlled the stillness of a man who was always thinking 2 moves ahead. The one in the middle had a scar that ran from his left temple down to the line of his jaw, thick and white against weathered skin. He was watching Nora the way a man watches something he can not yet decide is a threat or not. The one on the right was the largest human being Nora had ever seen in her life. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, and his hands were the size of small shovels. But something about his face, the way he held his mouth, the slight furrow between his brows, was not threatening. It was almost incredibly careful, like a man who had learned to be gentle because he understood exactly what he was capable of. 3 men, 3 badges which she could see glinting even at this distance. Nora picked up her satchel and started walking toward them. She had her contract in the inside pocket of her coat. The paper was folded into a perfect square and slightly worn at the edges from being taken out and looked at too many times. An agreement of marriage in good faith between Roy Calloway, chief detective of Ironfall, Arizona territory, and Nora Voss of New York City, New York. Signed. Dated. Witnessed by a notary on 42nd Street who had not looked up from his desk once during the entire transaction. She was 20 feet from the porch when the lean one stood up. He came down the steps the way water moves downhill, without hurry, without hesitation, as if the ground was simply where he was going next. He stopped in front of her, and up close she could see the gold flecks in those whiskey-colored eyes. And she could see that he was taller than she had estimated, and she could see that he had already decided something about her even before she opened her mouth. He took off his hat. That surprised her. She had not expected courtesy. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who did not raise it because he never needed to. "My name is Cade Harlow. I'm the acting chief detective of Ironfall." A pause, brief and loaded. "I need to tell you something before we go any further." Nora looked at him steadily. She had spent 3 years in newsrooms full of men who did not want her there, and she had learned that the first thing you never do is look away. "Tell me." "Roy Calloway died 19 days ago." The words went into her like a blade going into cold water clean and then immediately deeply cold. She did not move. She had spent enough years controlling her face in rooms where showing anything was weakness. She stood there on the dusty street of Ironfall and kept her expression exactly where it was. "How?" she said. It was not quite a question. "They're calling it sudden illness." Cade Harlow's eyes did not leave her face. "Heart," they said. He was 53 years old and healthy as a draft horse 3 weeks ago. Another pause. "They said." Nora heard what he was not saying. She filed it carefully in the part of her mind that collected things she would need later. "The contract," she said, "is legally void." His voice was not unkind. It was simply honest in the way that a man is honest when he has decided that kindness that misleads is not actually kindness at all. "You're not obligated to stay. The next eastbound train comes through on Thursday." Thursday was 4 days away. Nora looked past Cade Harlow at the two men still on the porch. The scarred one had let his chair drop forward, both boots on the floor now. The large one was watching her with that careful expression as if he was trying to work out something that mattered. She looked back at Cade. "Is there a boarding house?" she said. Something shifted in his face. Just for a moment, something that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. "Eugenia Pratt runs the boarding house," he said, "third building on the left. She sets dinner at 6 and she doesn't tolerate noise after 9. "Thank you," Nora said. She picked up her satchel and walked past him toward the boarding house. She felt his eyes on her back the whole way. Eugenia Pratt was a woman in her 60s who had the quality of furniture that has been in a house so long it seems to have grown there. She was broad-shouldered and gray-haired, and she looked at Nora the way a woman looks at another woman when she is deciding whether to trust her, not quickly and not without thoroughness. "Roy Calloway's bride," she said. It was not a question. "His widow," but Nora said, "though I never met him." Eugenia considered this. "That's a hard kind of grief," she said finally. "Mourning something you never had." She picked up Nora's satchel before Nora could object and started up the stairs. "Room's on the second floor. Window faces the street. I'll bring water up directly." The room was small and clean, a narrow bed with a white coverlet, a washstand with a blue pitcher, a window with no curtains, because Nora would learn that in Ironfall, nobody put curtains on windows that faced the street. You wanted to see what was coming, and you wanted what was coming to know you could see it. Nora set her coat on the bed and went to the window. From here she could see the full length of the main street. The general store where a woman in a gray dress was sweeping the porch. The saloon, which even at this hour had 2 horses tied out front. The telegraph office, a narrow building between the assayer and the barber. And the detective's office, she could see it clearly from here, could see the 3 men who had returned to their chairs on the porch. She watched them for a long time. Then she reached into the bottom of her satchel, past the folded dresses, and the spare notebook, and the small leather case that held her writing instruments, and she pulled out the letter. Not Calloway's letter, she had that in her coat. This was a different letter, older, the paper soft with handling. It was from a man named Theodore Marsh, who worked as a land records clerk in Tucson, and who had written to the Tribune 6 months ago with a story he was too frightened to tell under his own name. There are documents Marsh had written, contracts, maps, filed under false names in the Territorial Land Office, but traceable if you know where to look. Hundreds of families displaced, dozens of claims stolen, and all of it leads back to one man. I won't write his name in this letter, but you'll know it when you see it. The man who holds the evidence is Roy Calloway, chief detective of Ironfall. He's been collecting it for 2 years. He's been waiting for someone he can trust. Nora had read that letter in her editor's office in New York, and she had looked out the window at Broadway, and she had thought about her father, Thomas Voss, a miner from the territories who had come east when she was 9 years old, with nothing but a story about a contract he had signed that had taken everything he owned. A man who had died at 51, still believing the loss was his own fault for not understanding the fine print. She had taken the Calloway assignment before her editor finished speaking. The mail-order bride arrangement had been her own idea. It was the only cover that made sense, the only reason a young woman from New York would travel alone to a place like Ironfall without raising questions that could get back to the wrong people. She had written to Calloway directly in code that he had established in his letter to Marsh. He had replied within 2 weeks. The arrangement had been his suggestion, not deceptive, but practical. The safest reason for a woman to travel here, he had written. And when you arrive, I will show you everything. He had not lived long enough to show her anything. Nora folded Marsh's letter back into its careful square and pressed it into the lining of her satchel where it belonged. Then she opened her notebook to the first clean page, picked up her pen, and wrote Calloway. 19 days. They called it sudden illness. Kate Harlow does not believe that, neither do I. The next morning taught her what Ironfall was. She woke at 5:30 to the sound of horses on the street and lay still for a moment listening to the town come alive, the creak of the general store, opening, someone chopping wood behind the boarding house, a dog barking twice and then stopping, as if it had remembered something that made barking seem pointless. She dressed, pinned her hair, and went downstairs. Eugenia Pratt was already in the kitchen pressing biscuit dough with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had been doing it since before Nora was born. She set a plate on the table without being asked. "Town meeting today," Eugenia said. "After church. You'll want to see it." "What kind of meeting?" Eugenia looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. "The kind where Kate Harlow tells people how things are going to be, and people decide whether they like it." A pause. "They always decide they like it, but they need to go through the deciding first." Nora ate her breakfast. She listened to the town through the kitchen window. She was good at listening. It was the first thing her first editor had taught her, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had smelled of pipe tobacco and ink, and who had told her on her first day, "The story is always in what people don't say. Your job is to hear the silence between the words." After breakfast, she walked. She walked the full length of the main street, once slowly, the way you walk through a room you are trying to memorize. The general store was run by a woman named Meredith Aldridge, a widow in her 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of quiet efficiency that comes from having managed everything alone for a long time. She nodded at Nora without warmth, but without coldness either, which Nora had learned was about the best you could expect from a western town on a first morning. The saloon was called the Copper King. Its barkeep was a heavy-set man named Duff, who polished glasses with the focused expression of a man whose thoughts were always somewhere else. 3 tables occupied even this early by men who were not drinking so much as existing in the way men exist when the night before has not yet entirely released them. The telegraph office was run by a boy who looked no older than 16 and who blushed when Nora asked him how long a message took to reach New York. "Day maybe 2, ma'am," he said and looked at his shoes. At the far end of the street, just past the assayer's office, the livery stable sat with its wide doors open to the morning. A man she did not recognize was moving hay with a pitchfork, heavy-set with the wariness of someone newly arrived somewhere who has not yet decided whether the job is worth the trouble. He looked up when she walked past. He looked at her a beat longer than strangers usually looked at strangers in a town this small. She filed it without knowing why and continued on. She was on her way back toward the boarding house when she heard it. The voice was coming from the general store, a man's voice raised in the pitch that is not quite shouting, but has decided shouting is probably next. Nora stopped. Through the open door of the store, she could see Meredith Aldridge standing behind her counter, with her hands flat on the wood and her jaw set in the expression of a woman who has been through enough that very little frightens her anymore. But this is still unpleasant. In front of the counter, a thin man in a coat that had seen considerably better years was holding a sack of flour against his chest like it was something he had earned. "I said I'll pay next week," the man was saying. "What in the hell is the problem?" "The problem," Meredith Aldridge said, with the careful patience of a woman who has said a thing many times and is running low on the patience required to say it again, "is that you said next week last week and the week before that, and I cannot run a store on your promises, Jeb. Then I'll just take it and you can add it to what I owe." "You'll put it back," a voice said. Nora turned. Kate Harlow was standing in the doorway of the general store. She had not heard him coming. He had simply appeared the way a fact appears, not gradually, but suddenly present, as if it had always been there, and you simply hadn't noticed until now. The thin man Jeb went pale in the way of a man who has just remembered something he would have preferred to forget. I was just leaving, Jeb said, with merchandise you haven't paid for. This came from the scarred man, Slade Merritt, who materialized at the doorway behind Cade with a kind of quiet inevitability. His voice was flat as the desert. I said I'll pay. And Mrs. Aldridge said no. This was Boone Aldridge, no relation Nora would learn, who appeared at Jeb's left flank. The man was enormous in the enclosed space of the store, but his voice when he spoke was surprisingly unhurried. Almost gentle. Put the flour down, Jeb. What happened next was fast. Jeb's free hand moved toward his belt, not to a gun, but to the handle of a knife tucked in his waistband. The movement was instinct more than intention, the flinch of a man who had survived by threatening before he could be threatened. Cade crossed the room. That was the only way to describe it. One moment he was in the doorway. The next moment he was behind Jeb, one hand locked around the man's wrist, the knife on the floor, Jeb face down on the counter with his arm twisted behind him. The flour sack had dropped. White dust billowed up in a slow cloud and settled on everything. Cade had not raised his voice. He had not changed his expression. He looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced. You know the rules, Jeb, he said. His voice was almost pleasant. You take what isn't yours in Ironfall. You pay for it. I was going to pay. Jeb's voice was strained against the counter. You owe Mrs. Aldridge $14 beyond what's in your pockets. Cade looked up at Meredith Aldridge. What needs doing around here? The woman looked at the man pinned against her counter, and something in her expression was not satisfaction exactly, but the relief of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time and has just been offered help putting it down. Fence at the back needs mending, she said. Wood needs splitting. Inventory hasn't been counted in 2 months. Jeb's going to handle all of it, Cade said. Starting now. Slade, you stay with him. Slade Merritt took Jeb by the collar and walked him out through the back of the store without a word. Through the store window, Nora could see him pointing at a pile of fence posts with the patient expression of a man who expected this to happen exactly the way it was happening. Cade turned to Meredith Aldridge. Anything else? He took a tin of tobacco 2 weeks back. Said he'd pay. Hasn't. Added to his work debt. Meredith Aldridge nodded. For the first time since Nora had seen her, the set of her jaw softened. Not much, but enough to notice. Cade turned. He looked at Nora, who was standing in the doorway of the store with her notebook in her hand. She had not been aware of opening it. She had not been aware of beginning to write. But there it was, 3 lines of quick, close script, her pen still in her hand. You getting all that down, Miss Voss, he said. It was not mocking. It was something more careful than that. An observation, a question beneath the question. Nora looked at what she had written, looked at him. You sentenced a man to forced labor without a trial, she said. I gave him a choice. Cade walked toward her, and she stepped back to let him through the doorway, and they stood together on the porch of the general store in the morning heat. Work off what he owes or spend a month in our jail. He chose work. You didn't give him time to choose. You had him against the counter before he could think. He was reaching for a knife. He was scared. Scared men with knives hurt people. Cade looked at her steadily. Mrs. Aldridge gets her money back. Jeb learns that stealing in Ironfall has consequences, and nobody bleeds. Tell me where the injustice is. The injustice is that you decided the sentence, executed the sentence, and enforced the sentence. You're the law and the judge and the jailer all at once. There's no appeal. There's no, this isn't New York. His voice did not change. It did not harden or rise. It simply stated what it stated. There's no courthouse within 100 miles. There's no judge riding circuit until November. If I wait for proper procedure, Mrs. Aldridge doesn't see her money this decade and Jeb does it again tomorrow. He paused. Before we came to Ironfall, she didn't sleep. I know because I asked her. 3 years of being stolen from and threatened and having nobody to go to. She slept the first night we were here. Another pause. That's what I'm protecting. Not procedure. Her. Nora looked at him. She had written about men like this, or she had thought she had. She had written about power exercised without accountability, about the gap between what men called justice and what justice actually was. She had those words ready. She had used them in front of senators and police commissioners and men who wore better suits than Kate Harlow and lived in better buildings and were, when you got down to the bottom of it, doing exactly the same thing, making the rules and enforcing them and calling it order. But something about the way he had said her gave her pause. Not the word, on, the weight behind it. She looked down at her notebook. She wrote one more line. She closed the notebook and put it in her satchel. Cade was already walking away. She found the library that afternoon. It was not much of a library, a back room in the schoolhouse. 3 shelves of books donated by various people over various years with no apparent organizing principle, except that they were books and they had ended up here. But in the corner of that room behind the 3rd shelf, she found a locked cabinet. Old, heavy, the kind of cabinet that is built to protect something more important than books. The lock was no great challenge. Nora had learned to pick locks from a locksmith in Brooklyn who owed her a favor for a story she had buried 3 years ago. She had the cabinet open in 4 minutes. Inside were papers, land surveys, maps with sections marked in red pencil. And beneath those, a thin stack of letters written in the same careful, deliberate handwriting she recognized from Roy Calloway's letter to her. She did not have time to read more than 2 pages before she heard footsteps in the schoolhouse doorway. She closed the cabinet. She stood up. Cade Harlow was standing in the doorway of the back room, and in his hand was her satchel, which she had left on the bench in the main room when she came in here. He set it down on the table between them. Then he reached into his coat pocket and set something else on the table. Her notebook. Not the one she had been writing in that morning. The other one. The small one bound in black leather with the Tribune cipher on the inside cover that nobody would recognize unless they knew what they were looking at. But Cade Harlow, it turned out, knew what he was looking at. "This fell out of your bag this morning," he said, "when you stepped back to let me through the doorway." Nora looked at it. "You read it," she said. "I can read cipher," he said. "Texas Rangers use the same system." He looked at her steadily. "Who are you, Miss Voss?" There are moments in a life that are hinges. Moments where you can feel the weight of what you decide in the next 10 seconds, settling over everything that comes after. Nora had been in enough of them to recognize this one. She could lie. She had prepared lies careful and layered the kind that hold up under pressure. She could say the notebook was personal code, a habit from her schooling, nothing more. But Cade Harlow was not a man she could lie to. She knew that the way you know certain things, not from evidence, but from the quality of stillness in a person's eyes, when they are waiting for the truth and will recognize anything less. "My name is Nora Voss," she said. "That part is real. I'm a reporter for the New York Tribune. Investigative. I've been working a story for 8 months about fraudulent land seizures in the Arizona Territory, hundreds of families displaced through forged contracts and manipulated filings in the Territorial Land Office. All of it traceable to one source." She paused. "Senator Silas Drummond of New York." Kay did not move. "The mail-order bride arrangement was a cover," she continued. "It was the only way I could leave New York without Drummond's people following me. He has people watching the rail stations, the docks, the Tribune building. A woman traveling alone raises questions. A woman traveling to meet a husband does not." She looked at the cabinet behind her. Roy Calloway had been collecting evidence for 2 years. He contacted my paper through a third party. He was waiting for someone he could trust to receive it and take it out of the territory safely. "And he died before you got here," Cade said. "Yes." Silence. Outside, the afternoon wind moved through Ironfall the way it always did, low and patient, carrying red dust, carrying the smell of sage and heated rock and something indefinably old. "Roy Calloway was my friend," Cade said. His voice had changed. Not broken, not softened, but changed as if something under the surface of it had shifted. "The best lawman I've ever known. 20 years on the frontier, never once took a bribe, never once looked the other way. 3 weeks ago he was healthy. 2 weeks ago he was sick. 19 days ago he was dead." He picked up her notebook from the table and held it out to her. "They said it was his heart." "You don't believe that," Nora said. "I believe his heart stopped," Cade said. "I don't believe it stopped on its own." Nora took the notebook. She held it for a moment, thinking about the weight of what was sitting on the table between them, not the objects, but the words, the things they had just said to each other that could not be unsaid. "The cabinet," she said. "The papers inside. Did you know about them?" I knew Roy kept records, I didn't know where. He looked at the cabinet. He was careful that way, kept things compartmentalized. Said the safest evidence was the evidence that only one person knew about. A pause. He was right until he wasn't. I need to read everything in that cabinet, Nora said. All of it carefully before anything else moves. I know. And I need to know that what I find stays between us until I have the full picture. Cade looked at her for a long time. It was the kind of look that takes the measure of a person, not their appearance, not their credentials, but the thing underneath both of those. The thing that determines in the end whether a person stands or runs when standing is the harder choice. You came 2,000 miles alone, he said, to a town you'd never been to meet a man you'd never seen, because a dead man's evidence might bring down a sitting senator. He paused. Most reporters I've heard about write about things after they happen. Most reporters, Nora said, haven't lost anything yet. Something moved in his face. Quiet and deep, like something shifting under the surface of still water. All right, Miss Voss, he said. Here's how this works. You read everything in that cabinet. You share with me what you find. If it tells us what I think it's going to tell us about Roy, about who killed him, and why, then we handle it together. Not the New York way, not with lawyers and depositions and things that take 6 months. The Ironfall way. He held her gaze. And when it's done, you write your story, all of it. The truth, however it falls. Including you, Nora said. Including how this town operates. Including everything. He said it without flinching. I don't need people to approve of what I do. I need them to understand why I do it. There's a difference, madame. Nora opened her notebook to a clean page. She wrote one line. Roy Calloway was murdered, and Cade Harlow has been waiting for someone to prove it. She looked up. Then we'd better start, she said. Outside Ironfall went on about its afternoon. Slade Merritt supervised a sullen man mending a fence in the heat. Boone Aldridge helped an old woman carry a crate of supplies across the street. The telegraph boy sat in his narrow office, watching the door with the patient hope of someone waiting for the world to send him something interesting. None of them knew yet that it already had. The sun was going down behind the Mogollon Rim, painting the red rock purple and gold, and the deep orange that exists only in Arizona when the day is ending. The shadows went long across the main street of Ironfall, long and slow, and Nora Voss stood at the window of the back room of the schoolhouse with the dead man's papers in her hands. She had come here to find a story. What she was beginning to understand, in the way you begin to understand things that have been true for longer than you knew, was that the story had been here all along, waiting for her. The documents took 3 days to read properly. Not because there were so many of them, though there were surveys and letters and maps with notations in Calloway's careful hand, and beneath those copies of territorial land filings that had been altered so subtly that you would have to know what you were looking for to see the alterations at all. It took 3 days because Nora read each page the way her first editor had taught her to read documents that mattered slowly twice, with the assumption that everything she believed about it after the first read was probably wrong. She worked in the back room of the schoolhouse after the children went home each afternoon, when the light through the west window was long and amber and the town outside went quiet in the way of western towns. In the late afternoon, a kind of held breath before the evening decided what kind of evening it intended to be. Cade Harlow came each day at the end of that hour and sat across the table from her, and they went through what she had found. He did not read over her shoulder. He did not rush her. He sat with the patience of a man who has learned that patience is not the absence of urgency, but the discipline to let urgency serve you rather than drive you. On the third day, she put down the last page and looked at him. 23 families, she said, between 1881 and 1887. Land seized through contracts they signed without understanding what they were signing. In most cases, the contracts had been altered after signing terms changed, acreage, reduced dates manipulated. The forgeries are good. You'd need a documents expert to prove them in court. But Calloway had traced the original filings in Tucson and marked the discrepancies. Cade looked at the papers spread across the table. Names, he said, all of them. And at the top of the chain, every single time, the same legal firm out of Washington, D.C., the same firm that has handled Senator Drummond's private land interests for 11 years. She paused. He didn't just take the land. He took it systematically from people who couldn't fight back over years, and then he sold it to the railroad companies at 10 times what it was worth. He made himself rich 3 times over, and the people he took it from, farmers, miners, families who had worked that ground for a decade, most of them went east with nothing. Cade was quiet for a moment. Roy had been building this for 2 years, he said. Not a question, thinking aloud. He was waiting until he had enough that it couldn't be dismissed, enough that someone with the right platform could take it public and make it stick. He contacted the Tribune 6 months ago, Nora said, through a land records clerk named Theodore Marsh in Tucson. Marsh found the discrepancies and was too frightened to go public himself. He passed the information to Roy, who had already been building the same case from this end. She looked at the documents. Roy had everything. The maps, the forged contracts, the chain of ownership, the dates. Everything except a witness who could testify in Washington about what they'd seen, signed, and when. A pause. That was going to be Marsh, until Marsh went quiet 8 weeks ago. No letters, no telegrams. Gone. Gone, Cade repeated. Or made to go, Nora said. The amber light through the window had gone dark gold, the last of it. Somewhere outside, a horse moved on the street, and the sound of it was lonely in the quiet. And then Roy died, Cade said. And then Roy died, Nora said, 19 days before I arrived. They sat with that for a moment, the weight of what it meant, the shape of it. Drummond knew Calloway was building a case, Cade said. He had to. A man with that kind of reach, with that many people watching his interests, he would have known. And he would have moved to stop it before it got to someone who could use it. He couldn't stop Roy directly, Nora said. A frontier detective dying of a bullet would raise questions. But a sudden illness, a heart that simply stopped one morning, that's grief, that's a hard life catching up. That's the territory taking another good man. She looked at the papers. He was poisoned slowly. That's what I think, something that takes weeks, something that looks like natural decline. Cade's jaw tightened. It was the only visible sign that any of this was hitting him the way it was hitting him. Then Roy knew, he said quietly. At the end, he knew what was happening to him. His eyes went to the cabinet, and he still came in every day, still kept the records, still... He stopped. Still arranged for someone to come receive them, Nora said gently. Silence. Outside Ironfall was beginning its evening. She could hear it, the saloon picking up the sound of boots on boardwalk, someone calling out to someone else in the easy way of people who have known each other long enough that shouting across the street is not rude, but affectionate. Cade stood up. He picked up his hat from the table and held it in both hands for a moment looking at it. Tomorrow night is the town social, he said. Dance, every month the last Saturday. People need it, something that isn't just surviving. He put the hat on. You should come. You've been in this room for 3 days. People are starting to wonder about the woman in the schoolhouse. I don't want to draw attention. You're already drawing attention. The difference is that at the dance you can talk to people. He looked at her steadily. Half your story is in those papers. The other half is in the people of this town. What they lived through, what they lost, what they think about what was done to them. He paused. Roy didn't just want a journalist to carry his evidence to Washington. He wanted someone to tell these people's stories. There are 23 families in those documents. Some of them still live within a day's ride of here. Nora looked at the papers on the table. She thought about her father, Thomas Voss, who had come east with nothing and died still believing it was his fault. What time does the dance start? She said. She wore the blue dress. It was the only dress she had brought that was not strictly practical, and she had brought it on impulse, and she had questioned that impulse on every mile of the journey west. And now she put it on in the small room above Eugenia Pratt's kitchen and looked at herself in the narrow mirror and thought, well, here you are. The town hall was at the far end of Main Street, a large wooden building with a raised floor that had been built for exactly this purpose, for the kind of evening when a town needed to remember it would more than just work and weather and the daily business of staying alive. By the time Nora arrived at 7, the room was already alive with noise and movement. A small band in the corner fiddle guitar, and a man on the concertina who played with his eyes closed and his foot keeping time. Couples on the floor. Children underfoot. Men along the walls in the careful posture of men who want to dance but require someone else to make the first move. She spotted the three detectives immediately. They were near the refreshment table, cleaned it up from their working day in a way that revealed different things about each of them. Cade Harlow, in a white shirt without his coat, which showed the lean, capable build of a man who has spent years in saddles and on foot in rough country. Slade Merritt, with his scar catching the lamplight, standing very still, watching the room the way he always watched things, cataloging, assessing, filing. And Boone Aldridge, enormous in the warm room, bending down to let a small girl put a flower in his vest pocket, with an expression of solemn acceptance that struck Nora as oddly moving. She took a cup of punch from the refreshment table and positioned herself where she could watch without obviously watching. That was when it happened. She heard Pearl Dunmore before she saw her, a sound that was cut short, the beginning of a word that did not finish. Nora turned. At the far end of the room near the side door, Pearl was backed against the wall by a man who had her wrist in one hand and was leaning in close in the way of men who believe proximity is the same as permission. Pearl's face was pale and very still, the stillness of a woman calculating how badly this is going to go. Slade Merritt covered the length of the room in the time it took Nora to process what she was seeing. He did not shout. He did not reach for his gun. He took the man by the back of his collar and removed him from Pearl's vicinity with the unhurried efficiency of a man moving furniture. And then he put himself between Pearl and the man with a finality that required no explanation. "Outside," he said. The man opened his mouth. "Outside," Slade said again in a voice that had no volume and no warmth and no negotiating position whatsoever. The man went outside. Slade went with him. The band played on. Most of the room had not noticed. Nora crossed to where Pearl was standing still against the wall, pressing the wrist that had been grabbed with her other hand. "Are you all right?" Nora said. Pearl nodded, swallowed. "He grabbed me as I was coming in the door. I didn't expect—" She stopped, drew a breath. "I'm all right." Through the side door, which had swung shut but not latched, Nora could hear Slade's voice and the other man's voice, and then after a short time only one set of footsteps walking away, and then the sound of a horse being saddled and ridden out of town at a pace that suggested the rider had been given a strong reason to move quickly. Slade came back through the door. He looked at Pearl. "You're not hurt?" "No," Pearl said. "Thank you." Slade nodded. He looked as if he was going to say something else, and then thought better of it and went back to his place at the wall with the expression of a man who has done a necessary thing and would prefer not to discuss it. Pearl looked at Nora. "He does that," she said quietly. "All three of them do that. A year ago, I wouldn't have gone to a dance alone. I was too frightened." She looked at the room. "No, I go wherever I want in this town." Nora wrote nothing down. She was not holding her notebook, but she filed it in the careful internal register she kept for things that mattered. At what cost, she might have asked. She had asked that question before at other times to other people who had told her they felt safe. But she looked at Pearl Dunmore's face, the color returning to it, the steadiness coming back into her eyes, the way she smoothed her dress and squared her shoulders and walked back into the middle of the room and accepted a dance from the schoolmaster, and the question felt less simple than it usually did. Slade found her an hour later. She had worked her way to a quiet corner and was on her second cup of punch, which she had determined was about 70% sugar and the rest something that might have once been fruit, and she was watching the room do what rooms like this do when people have stopped being careful. He appeared at her elbow without ceremony in the way of men who have spent years approaching things quietly. "Dance," he said. "I don't think—" "Not asking you to marry me," he said. "Just to dance." She looked at him. Up close, the scar was even more pronounced, a thick white line against weathered skin that ran from his left temple across the cheekbone down to the angle of his jaw. It was an old scar, years old, and she had learned in her work that old scars meant stories, and stories meant things people had survived. "All right," she said. He was a surprising dancer. Not graceful exactly, but controlled. He led clearly and did not crowd her, and kept time with a precision that suggested he had either been taught very well or had practiced very determinedly, or both. "You've been in that schoolhouse for 3 days," he said. "I've been working." "I know what you've been working on." He turned her through the other couples with an ease that came from being taller than most obstacles. "Cade told us. All of it. Enough." His voice was low, meant only to carry between them. "The documents. Calloway? Drummond. A pause. I want to tell you something. Nora looked at him. The day you arrived, Slade said. I was in the telegraph office when a message came through, addressed to the Ironfall detective's office. His jaw tightened fractionally. It was from a number code I recognized. I knew it from before, from when I did different work for different people. It was a confirmation request from one of Drummond's men. They wanted to know if a woman named Nora Voss had arrived on the morning train. Nora's feet continued to move through the steps. Her face did not change. And, she said, and I destroyed the telegram, Slade said. I told the boy it had been addressed wrong, and I took it and burned it. The music moved around them. Other couples dipped and turned. Why? Nora said. Because I know what those codes mean. His voice had gone flat in the way of a man recounting something he is not proud of. Before I came to Ironfall, before Cade found me, I tracked people for money. Brought them back dead more times than alive. Didn't ask who was paying or why. Just took the work. He paused. Drummond hired me twice, in '84 and again in '86. I didn't know then what I know now about what he was doing, but I knew the codes meant someone wanted someone found. And what happened to the people who got found? He looked at her steadily. That telegram wasn't a request for information. It was a confirmation step. The next step after confirmation is not a letter. The music slowed. They slowed with it. He knows I'm here, Nora said. Not a question. He's known since the day you arrived, Slade said. The question is why nothing has happened yet. He paused, which means either his people are not here yet, or they are here and they're waiting for something. For the documents, Nora said. If they can get the documents back before I get them out of the territory, Drummond is safe. I'm a journalist with nothing but a story I can't prove. That's what I think too. The song ended. They stopped. Slade released her hand. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has said what he came to say and is not asking for anything in return. I'm not a good man, he said. I've done things that don't go away. But Roy Calloway gave me a chance to be something other than what I was. A pause. Whatever Cade decides to do about this, I'm with him. And I'm with you. He walked back to the wall. Nora stood in the middle of the dance floor and breathed carefully and thought about the telegram that had been sent and received and destroyed on the day she arrived, and about what it meant that the chain of events had been set in motion before she had even walked down the main street of Ironfall. Boone appeared at her side. You need some air, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. The garden behind the town hall was small and lantern-lit and smelled of sage and the damp earth smell of irrigated ground in the desert where water is precious enough that growing flowers is a kind of defiance. Boone Aldridge folded himself onto a bench with the deliberateness of a man who has learned to navigate a world built for smaller people. He handed her a glass of water, real water, not the punch, and she drank it gratefully. Slade told you, he said. Yes. Good. He looked at the lanterns in the tree branches above them. We've been waiting for someone to come. Cade said Roy wouldn't have built all that without a plan for getting it out. Said Roy was too careful to let it just sit there. He paused. I didn't expect it to be a mail-order bride from New York. I didn't expect this to be where I ended up, Nora said. He smiled at that. It transformed his face entirely, all that size and solidity softening into something that was purely warm. Roy picked well, he said quietly. He always picked well. They sat for a moment in the kind of companionable silence that takes time to earn, and Nora had not expected to earn here this quickly with this man. Can I ask you something? Nora said. You can ask, he said. I may not answer. What made you come here to Ironfall? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might take the second option. Then he said, I killed a man in a fight bare knuckle in a mining camp outside of Prescott. Didn't mean to. Hit him wrong and he went down and didn't get up. He looked at his hands, those enormous hands resting on his knees. The camp ruled it an accident. Nobody charged me. I was back fighting the next month. He paused. I couldn't stop seeing his face. Couldn't stop thinking, this is what my hands are for. This is all they're good for. He looked up at the lanterns. Cade came through Prescott 18 months later. Said he was building something in Ironfall. Said he needed men who understood force well enough to know when not to use it. He paused. I've been here ever since. Nora looked at him. She thought about what it costs a man to say a thing like that to a person he has known for 3 days. She thought about the small girl who had put a flower in his pocket tonight and the expression on his face when she did it. You use your hands differently now, she said. I try, he said simply. Cade found them 10 minutes later. He stood in the garden doorway and looked at Nora with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he had something to say that was important enough to override whatever else was happening. Come back inside, he said. There's someone you need to see. The man was at the bar of the Copper King. They walked past the town hall, the music still going the evening, still warm, and down the main street to the saloon. And Cade held the door for her, and they went in together, and Nora saw the man immediately because Cade's stillness the moment they entered told her exactly which person in the room had put that stillness into him. He was perhaps 45 with the compact economical build of a man who kept himself in working condition the way a craftsman keeps his tools. His clothes were good, better than most men who came through Ironfall. A merchant's clothes or a land surveyor's the clothes of a man with a professional reason to be somewhere. He had a drink in front of him that he had not touched. He was watching the room with the patient attention of a man who is not drinking, but is waiting. His eyes found Nora across the room. They found her the way a scope finds a target directly without hesitation, without the slight adjustment that most eyes make when they locate a new face. He had known she was there before she walked through the door. His name is Fletcher Oaks, Cade said quietly at her shoulder. I know him from Texas, San Antonio, 1883. He was working for a land company, then acquisition work they called it, persuading people who didn't want to sell. His voice was level and very quiet. 3 people died in connection with that company's operations. Nothing was ever proven against Oaks specifically. He's here for the documents, Nora said. He's here for whatever Drummond sent him for, Cade said, which may be the documents. Maybe more than that. He paused. He came in on the afternoon stage, registered at Eugenia's boarding house as a merchant, scouting land for development. He's staying at the same boarding house as me. I know, his voice did not change. You're not going back there tonight. Slade will collect your things. Nora looked at Oaks across the room. He was still watching her with that level, unhurried attention. He wants me to know he's here, she said. Yes. He's not hiding. He registered under his own name, Frank Delroy, but it's Oaks. I'd know that face anywhere. As if the sound of his name, either name, had been a signal, or Oaks picked up his glass and rose from his stool and walked toward them. Not quickly, not slowly, with the measured pace of a man who is comfortable with his own intentions. He stopped 2 feet from Nora. He did not look at Cade. He looked at her. Miss Voss, he said. His voice was light, almost pleasant, the voice of a man who has practiced pleasantness until it no longer required any effort. I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your work at the Tribune is quite something. That piece you wrote about the railroad contracts in 87 thorough reporting. Thank you, Nora said. Must have taken considerable courage, and he said, writing things that powerful men prefer not to see written. He let a moment pass. Things like that carry risks. I imagine you know that better than most. Nora held his gaze. She had stood in front of men like this, before men who communicated threat through pleasantry, who said one thing with their mouths and another thing with their eyes, who depended on you hearing both layers and being frightened by the gap between them. She was frightened. That was real. But she had been frightened before, and she had learned that the only thing that fear was good for was telling you what was important. I do know that, she said. It's part of the job. Of course, a slight smile. I'm in town for a few days on business, land survey work. If you're working on a story about the territory, I'd be happy to share some of what I know about current development interests in this region. He paused. There are things happening here that would interest your readers. I'll keep that in mind, Nora said. He looked at her for one moment longer, a look that said everything his words were carefully not saying, and then he nodded pleasantly to both of them and carried his drink back to the bar. Nora turned to Cade. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. He's going to come for the documents, she said. Yes. Then we need to move them, tonight. Cade looked at her. Already done, he said. Slade moved them this afternoon when I told him you'd been in that cabinet. They're in the cabin. A pause. But he may not know that. He may not know exactly what Calloway had or where it was. He knows you arrived and started spending time in the schoolhouse. That's all. He'll find out. Yes, Kate said. He will. He looked toward the bar where Oak sat, which means we need to know how much time we have. He had Nora spend the night at the cabin, which was safer than anywhere in town, and Slade rode in quietly to collect her things from Eugenia's boarding house before Oaks could search them. She slept in the spare bunk with the sound of the desert outside and woke before dawn to find coffee already made and Boone already awake, which suggested he had not slept at all. 3 days later, she would learn that they had less time than either of them thought. It was Oaks who told her. He found her walking alone on the main street in the late morning. She had been to the telegraph office to check for a message from Theodore Marsh, who remained silent, and she was thinking about what that silence meant, and she turned a corner and Oaks was there. Not a coincidence. She had stopped believing in coincidences on day one. "A moment of your time, Miss Voss," he said, pleasantly, always pleasantly. She stopped. "Mr. Delroy." A slight acknowledgement of the name she had used, he did not correct it. He fell into step beside her. Two people having a morning conversation on a quiet street. "I'll be direct," he said. "I think you'd prefer that." "I would," she said. "You have documents that belong to a client of mine," he said. "They were improperly obtained and removed from their original filing context, and they represent a considerable misrepresentation of my client's legitimate business activities." His voice was still pleasant. "A business matter, merely administrative. My client would like them returned." "Your client's name," Nora said, "isn't relevant," he said. "What's relevant is that the documents in question in the wrong hands could cause considerable difficulty for a number of parties who have done nothing wrong. Whereas in the right hands returned to their proper context, they simply cease to exist. In all of this, a slight gesture that encompassed Ironfall and the desert and the territorial sky becomes something that never happened." Nora walked. She did not stop walking. She did not look at him. "And if I decline," she said, "then you would continue in possession of documents that can't be verified that you obtained through a false identity in circumstances that would not reflect well on your professional reputation." He paused. "And you would do so in a remote territorial town, a considerable distance from anyone who might notice if something unfortunate were to happen." Nora stopped. She looked at him. He was watching her with that light professional attention, not angry, not threatening in any way that a witness could describe, just a man having a conversation. She thought about Roy Calloway, about what those weeks of slow poisoning must have been like, about coming into the office every morning, knowing what was happening, still filing the papers, still keeping the records, still setting the chain of events in motion that had brought her here. She thought about her father. 23 families, contracts that had been altered after signing by men exactly like the one standing in front of her. "No," she said. Oaks looked at her. The pleasantness did not change. "I appreciate your candor," he said, and he walked away. Nora stood on the main street of Ironfall and watched him go and held herself very still until she was certain her breathing had returned to something normal. Then she turned and walked toward the detective's office. Her steps, even her face, composed her mind, already moving through everything she knew and everything she needed to do next. She had come here for a story. What she was beginning to understand walking through the dust in the heat of a frontier town where a good man had been quietly killed for the crime of writing down the truth was that stories cost something. Roy Calloway had paid the full price. She was not willing to let that payment go to waste. Inside the detective's office, Kate Harlow looked up from the desk when she came through the door. He read her face the way he had learned to read things directly without softening. "He approached you," he said. "He offered me a deal," she said. "Return the documents. Walk away." He was very polite about it. "And you told him?" "I told him no." Kate looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the afternoon wind moved through Ironfall, low and patient, carrying the smell of sage, and heated rock, carrying the quiet of a town that does not yet know what is coming. "Then we move fast," he said. "Starting tonight." Nora put her hand on the desk between them. "Tonight," she said. Outside, Fletcher Oaks was walking toward Eugenia Pratt's boarding house. He was still being pleasant. That was the most frightening thing about him. The cabin sat a mile outside of Ironfall proper at the end of a track that was not quite a road and not quite nothing, the kind of path made by men who walked the same way often enough that the ground remembered them. Kate brought her there that night. Not Slade, not Boone. Cade himself walking beside her in the dark without a lantern, because a lantern was a position and a position was a target, and Cade Harlow had not survived 20 years on the frontier by making himself easy to locate. The stars over Arizona were extraordinary. More stars than sky, it seemed a density of light that New York with all its gas lamps could not have imagined. She walked beside him and said nothing, and listened to the desert around them, which was not silent at all, but full of the small, alive sounds of things that moved in the dark and knew how to live in it. The cabin was solid and low-built into a rise in the ground, so that it sat partly sheltered by the earth itself. Smoke from the chimney, light in one window. Slade's horse tied outside, which meant Slade was already inside, which meant Kate had arranged this before he had come to find her. He had been planning for this since Oaks arrived. She understood that now. Inside the cabin was warm and spare in the way of men who owned what they needed and nothing more. A stone fireplace, a long table with 4 chairs, shelves along one wall carrying the things that told you who a person was if you knew how to read them, battered copy of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, a surveyor's compass, 3 boxes of cartridges, a Bible with a broken spine that had been read to pieces, 2 books of poetry that she did not expect, and that she filed away in the part of her mind that collected surprises. Boone was at the fireplace. Slade was at the table with the documents spread before him, organized in a way that suggested he had been studying them for hours. They all looked at her when she came in, not with suspicion, with something more serious than that, with the look of men who have made a decision about a person and are now living inside that decision. "Sit down," Cade said. "All 4 of us need to talk." They talked for 2 hours. Cade laid it out the way he laid everything out, directly without ornament, in the sequence that mattered. Oaks had approached Nora. Oaks had made an offer. Nora had declined. That refusal was now a fact that Oaks had taken back to whoever he was reporting to, and the clock on what came next had started running. "He'll move for the documents," Slade said. "That's still the priority. Without the documents, she's a journalist with a story she can't prove. With them, Drummond is finished." "He doesn't know they're here," Boone said. "He'll find out," Cade said. "He found out she was in the schoolhouse. He'll find out the documents moved. It's a matter of time." He looked at Nora. "How long to copy the essential materials? The forgeries, the chain of ownership, the names?" "I've already started," Nora said. "I've been copying in longhand every evening. I have the core documents reproduce, the altered contracts, the land maps with Calloway's notations, the chain of title going back to the original filings." She paused. "But the copies won't be enough on their own. The originals need to be verified by a documents examiner. The alterations are in the paper, the ink layers, the pressure, indentations. You can't photograph those in longhand reproduction." "Then the originals need to travel," Cade said. "In 3 directions," Nora said. All 3 men looked at her. She had been thinking about this for the past 3 days. In the schoolhouse, in the small room above Eugenia Pratt's kitchen, lying awake listening to the sound of iron falls settling into its night. She had been thinking about Roy Calloway, who had been careful enough to build the case over 2 years, but had kept everything in one place in one cabinet behind one lock. A single point of failure. A single throat to cut. She was not going to make the same mistake. "I need access to the telegraph," she said. "Tonight, if possible. I need to transmit the core evidentiary summary to 3 separate recipients: the Washington Evening Star, the Chicago Tribune, and the San Francisco Examiner. Not the full documents, which can't travel by wire. The summary, the chain of evidence, the names, the dates, the properties, the amounts. Enough that if the originals are destroyed, there is still a public record that cannot be recalled." "Drummond will see the transmissions," Slade said. "Drummond will see that 3 major newspapers in 3 different cities received the same information simultaneously," Nora said. "He can threaten 1 newspaper. He can buy 1 editor. He cannot buy 3 in 3 cities before the story runs. Once it runs, the documents become evidence in a public record, not just leverage." She paused. "That's when he loses the ability to make this go away quietly." Boone had been listening with his elbows on his knees and his big hands folded together. "And the originals," he said, "travel by courier to the U.S. Attorney's office in Tucson," Nora said. "Hand-delivered, with a letter from me and a letter from Cade attesting to how they were found and where they were held." She looked at Cade. Would you do that, sign your name to this? Cade looked at her for a long moment. I already signed my name to this, he said. When I walked Roy Calloway's coffin to Boot Hill and said the words over him, the paperwork is the easy part. Then Slade put the telegram on the table. He did it quietly the way he did most things, without announcement, without explanation, simply placing the thing where it needed to be and letting it speak for itself. It was a folded piece of paper slightly creased from being in his inside coat pocket, and he smoothed it once with his thumb before he let go of it. This came in this afternoon, he said. Boy at the telegraph office knows to bring certain things directly to me. I've had him watching the line since Oakes arrived. He looked at Nora. It's addressed to Oakes, Frank Delroy, in care of the Ironfall station. You opened it, Nora said. Yes. She picked it up. The message was in plain language, no cipher, because the sender had calculated that plain language was safer than code when you needed plausible deniability, and the recipient was experienced enough to read the implications himself. It was brief. It confirmed a receipt of a previous communication. It confirmed that the situation was to be resolved before Thursday, and it was signed with initials, only 2 letters, and a third that stood for a title. Nora read it twice. She set it down on the table and pressed her fingertips to the wood and breathed. The initials were not Drummond's, they were his chief of staff's. A man named Hargrove, who had served Drummond for 15 years, who had handled the administrative side of things that Drummond preferred not to touch directly, who was known in Washington as the kind of man who solved problems without leaving fingerprints. But at the bottom of the telegram, below the signature in a different hand, slightly hurried as if added at the last moment, were 4 words that were not instructions and not business. They were a name. Her name. Voss. Do not improvise. She understood what it meant. Oakes had reported that she had refused his offer. Hargrove was telling him that she was not to be dealt with through improvisation, meaning not violence, not yet, because violence against a named journalist with an established record at a major newspaper required a different level of preparation. They wanted the documents first. They wanted to assess what she had already transmitted. They were being careful. They were being careful, which meant they were not yet desperate. And men who were not yet desperate still operated within certain constraints. She had a window. She looked up at the 3 men around the table. They want the documents before Thursday, she said, which means Oakes will move tomorrow or Wednesday. Tonight is still safe. She paused. I need to be at the telegraph office in the next 2 hours. Cade looked at Slade. Slade looked at Boone. Something passed between the 3 of them, not words, but the kind of communication that comes from 2 years of working together in conditions where the wrong decision gets someone killed. I'll take you, Cade said. Then Boone said, there's something else. He had not moved from his position by the fire. His voice was the same unhurried voice it always was, but something in the quality of it made everyone at the table look at him. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, older than the telegram. The paper, a different weight and color, the handwriting on the outside, not Calloway's, but still familiar in a way Nora could not immediately place. Roy gave this to me, Boone said, 6 weeks before he died. He said to give it to whoever came for the documents. He said they would know what it meant. He held it out to Nora. I didn't read it. He asked me not to. Nora took it. She unfolded it. It was a land survey. Arizona Territory filed 1879. A parcel in the northern section of Ironfall, 240 acres, bounded on the north by the Mogollon Escarpment and on the south by the Ironfall Creek tributary. The survey was original unstamped, meaning this was the copy kept by the original owner, not the filed copy. At the bottom, in the original owner's signature line in a handwriting, she would have known in the dark the handwriting that had been in her life since before she knew what handwriting was. Thomas Voss. The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of people who have nothing to say, but the quiet of people who understand that they are in the presence of something that requires a moment to be what it is. Nora sat with her father's name on a piece of paper in her hands and felt the thing that happens when 2 parts of your life that you had believed were entirely separate reveal themselves to be a single continuous thing. Her father had told her once near the end about land in the territory, about a parcel he had owned and lost. He had told it the way he told everything about that time, briefly, with the careful flatness of a man who has learned that talking about certain losses makes them larger rather than smaller. He had said Arizona, good land. I signed something I shouldn't have, and that was that. She had been 12 years old. She had not known where in Arizona. She had not known Ironfall existed. But Roy Calloway had known. Roy Calloway had found Thomas Voss's name in the forged contracts, had cross-referenced it with the original filings, had traced the chain of theft back to its beginning, and found at that beginning the name of a man who had come east with nothing and raised a daughter who became a journalist, who exposed the powerful and protected the powerless. He had not needed a journalist. He had not needed a courier. He had needed an heir. The mail-order bride advertisement had not been a cover story that Nora had invented. Roy Calloway had placed that advertisement knowing exactly who might answer it, knowing that Theodore Marsh had contacted the Tribune, knowing that if the right journalist picked up the story and if that journalist was Thomas Voss's daughter, then the person coming to receive the documents would not be a stranger to the land they were about. They would be coming home. Nora sat with that understanding settling over her the way the desert dark settles completely without negotiation. Then Slade set a second telegram on the table, not the one from Hargrove, a different one. Older by 2 days, the paper more handled the origin stamp reading New York City. He had been carrying it since the afternoon. She could see from the way he set it down that he had been deciding when to give it to her and had decided now was the time. This came before Hargrove's, Slade said. Different sender. I held it because I wanted to understand it first. A pause. The origin code is the Tribune Building, 42nd Street. Nora looked at the telegram without touching it. The sender's name was Gerald Fitch, her editor. The man who had smelled of pipe tobacco and ink and who had told her on her first day at the Tribune, the story is always in what people don't say. The man she had trusted with every source, every draft, every dangerous story she had ever written. The man who had spent 30 years building something that mattered from a broadsheet with 4 employees. The man who had, according to the message now lying on the table in front of her, confirmed her location and her mission to a contact at Senator Drummond's Washington office in exchange for a guarantee that the Tribune would not be sued into bankruptcy and that Fitch himself would not face criminal charges for prior publication of restricted materials. 4 sentences, 40 words. The end of a thing she had believed in. She picked it up. She read it. She set it down. The fire in the cabin made its small sounds. Outside, the Arizona night was very large and very dark and completely indifferent to what was happening inside this room. Nora sat with the telegram for exactly 10 seconds. She counted them. Later, she would remember counting them the way you remember counting things when you need to stay attached to something measurable while the rest of your world rearranges itself. On the 10th second, she folded the telegram and pushed it to the center of the table. Gerald Fitch has been at that desk for 30 years, she said. Her voice was level. He built that paper from a broadsheet with 4 employees into something that mattered. He's 61 years old and he has a daughter who just started university and a wife who is ill in a newspaper that Drummond could have destroyed with 1 lawsuit. She paused. I understand why he did it. None of the 3 men said anything. It doesn't change what I'm going to do, she said. It just means I do it for different reasons now. Not for the paper, not for Fitch. She looked at the survey, still open on the table, her father's name visible from where she sat. For the 23 families in those documents. For Roy Calloway. Another pause, quieter. For my father. She picked up the survey and folded it carefully along its original lines and put it in the inside pocket of her coat against her chest, where it would stay. All right, she said, her voice was steady. Let's go send some telegrams. Cade looked at her for a long moment before he stood. It was not assessment this time, and it was not the cautious cataloging of someone deciding what to trust. It was something else, something he had not named yet, but that she could see in the quality of his stillness, the stillness of a man who has been holding a door open for a long time and has just watched the right person walk through it. He picked up his hat. Let's go, he said. The telegraph office was dark and locked at that hour, but the boy, his name was Edgar, she had learned 16 years old and burning with the ambition of someone who understands that where he is not where he intends to end up, had left the key with Slade as instructed, and they let themselves in quietly and lit a single lamp. Nora sat at the instrument, and Cade stood at the window and watched the street. She had composed the messages in her head during the walk from the cabin. 3 versions, Washington, Chicago, San Francisco, each slightly different in framing to account for each paper's readership and editorial style, each containing the same core information: the names, the properties, the dates, the chain of title, the nature of the forgeries, and the identity of the man at the center of it all. Senator Silas Drummond of New York, 23 families, 6 years, 3 territories. She transmitted Washington first. It took 11 minutes. Chicago took 9. San Francisco took 13. When the last transmission was complete, she sat back from the instrument and pressed both palms flat on the desk and breathed. "It's done," she said. Cade turned from the window. All three, whoever has the Drummond account in each of those cities is going to receive a very interesting morning." She paused. "The story will run within the week. Once it runs, destroying the originals is pointless. The information is public. The U.S. Attorney in Tucson will have enough from the published record to open an investigation, and the originals will simply confirm what's already known." "Drummond will know by morning," Cade said. "Drummond will know by morning," she agreed, "which means Oakes will know by morning. And Oakes will know that the window has closed." She looked at Cade steadily. "He may not respond well to that." "No," Cade said, "he won't." They walked back to the cabin in the dark, and the desert around them was wide and quiet, and neither of them spoke much, and that was all right. Oakes moved the next morning before the sun was fully up. She did not see it happen. She was in the cabin reviewing the original documents one last time before Slade set out for Tucson with them wrapped in oilcloth inside his saddlebag. She was sitting at the table with coffee that Boone had made. It turned out an excellent cook, which she had not expected and which seemed perfectly in character. Once she knew it, when Cade came through the door with the expression that she had learned meant something had already gone wrong. "He's got Pearl," Cade said. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. "Oakes took Pearl Dunmore this morning," Cade said. "She was walking to the schoolhouse. He has her in the livery stable at the south end of town. He sent a message." He held out a folded note. "He'll release her when the original documents are delivered to him personally. He wants the originals, and he wants you to swear on paper that no transmission has been made." A pause. "He doesn't know about the telegrams yet. He made his move before word could have reached him." Which meant they had hours, not days. As soon as Drummond's people in Washington discovered what had been transmitted, as soon as the morning editions began moving on the wire, Oakes's leverage collapsed entirely. He would know it. And a man whose leverage had just collapsed and who was looking at a kidnapping charge was a man with limited options and narrowing time. That made him more dangerous, not less. Nora stood up. "What's your play?" she said to Cade. He looked at her for one moment, and in that moment she saw not uncertainty, which she had not seen in him, but the weight of a man calculating risks against people he cares about. All of them. Pearl in the livery stable. The 3 of them. Her. "Slade rides for Tucson now," he said, "before anything else moves. He's clear of town before Oakes can recalculate." He looked at Slade. "You know the route." "I know the route," Slade said. He was already picking up the oilcloth package from the table. "Boone," Cade said. "I'll take the south approach to the livery." Boone said immediately. "Come in through the stockyard. He won't be watching that side." "There may be someone with him," Cade said. "There may be," Boone agreed. He said it with the equanimity of a man for whom these calculations were simply arithmetic. Slade went out the door without ceremony. She heard his horse move away into the morning dark. Boone picked up his coat. He looked at Nora before he went. He had the same look he'd given her in the garden at the dance, careful like a man who wants to say something important and is choosing his words with both hands. "That land is yours," he said. "Whatever happens today." Roy made sure of it. He paused. "Don't forget that." Then he went out the door. The cabin was quiet. The fire burned low. Nora looked at Cade. "You're going to the livery," she said. "Yes." "What do you need me to do?" "Stay here," he said. "No," she said. He looked at her, not with surprise, not with the condescension she had expected and prepared herself to push back against, with a kind of frank appraisal, the look of a man recalculating based on new information. "The telegraph office," she said. "I need to be at the telegraph office. If a response comes from any of the 3 papers, confirmation of receipt, questions about the documents, anything, someone needs to be there who knows how to handle it. Edgar is 16 years old." A pause. "The office is between the boarding house and the livery," he said. "I know where it is. If something goes wrong at the livery, Then I will be in a locked building with a telegraph instrument and the ability to summon a federal marshal within the hour, she said. That is not the worst position. He studied her for 3 full seconds. Lock the door, he said. Don't come out until one of us comes for you. Agreed, she said. He picked up his hat. He started for the door. Then he stopped his back to her, his hand on the doorframe. He stood there for a moment in the way of a man who has decided to say a thing and is finding the words for it for the first time. Roy Calloway told me once, he said that the bravest thing a person can do is stay honest in a world that keeps offering them reasons not to be. He paused. I didn't understand what he meant until 3 days ago. He went out into the morning. She was at the telegraph instrument when the shots came. 2 of them close together from the direction of the livery stable. Then a third, separate to a different caliber, which she knew because she had been listening to gunfire since she was 12 years old in mining camps where disputes had a resolution that did not involve lawyers. Then silence. She sat at the telegraph instrument and did not move and did not go to the door. She had given her word, and she intended to keep it, and she held on to that intention with both hands while the silence stretched and the morning light came through the narrow window of the telegraph office and lay in a long yellow stripe across the floor. The confirmation from the Washington Evening Star came through at 7:42 in the morning. She took it down in clean copy. Documents received. Story confirmed for evening edition. Attorney General's office contacted per attached instructions. Please advise on availability of original documents for federal review. She was writing the reply when the door opened. Boone came in first. He was unhurt, except for a cut above his left eye that he had pressed his sleeve against, and appeared to have already decided was not worth discussing. Behind him came Pearl Dunmore, pale and shaking but upright, with the quality of a woman who has been frightened to the bone and is now converting that fear into anger as fast as she can manage. Pearl looked at Nora, and Nora stood up, and they held each other for a moment with the wordless intensity of women who understand each other's fear without requiring an explanation of it. Fletcher Oaks, Nora said. Gone east, Boone said, fast as his horse would carry him. He sat down heavily in the chair by the door. Cade gave him the choice. He took it. And Cade? Coming, Boone said. He stopped to talk to a man. She found out later who that man was, the associate who had helped Oaks, the person inside Ironfall who had been on Drummond's payroll. A livery hand named Burl who had arrived in town 2 months before Nora, who had been sending reports north for 18 months. The same heavy-set man she had noticed on her first morning walking the main street, the one who had looked at her a beat too long. When Oaks had needed a Confederate inside the town, Burl had been there waiting. Cade handled it the Ironfall way. Work or jail or leave and don't come back. Burl chose to leave before the hour was out, riding west at a pace that suggested he had reconsidered his employment options thoroughly and permanently. The response from Chicago arrived at 9. San Francisco at 10 past. Both confirmed receipt. Both confirmed the story was moving. San Francisco's editor, a man named Prescott, whom Nora had never met, but who had a reputation for the kind of editorial courage that made powerful people extremely uncomfortable, had already wired the Associated Press wire service. 2 days after the transmissions, a telegram arrived from Tucson, not from the U.S. Attorney's Office, from a man named Theodore Marshland, records clerk, who identified himself in the first line and explained in the second that he had spent 8 weeks in hiding in a mining settlement outside of Yuma after receiving a visit from 2 men he did not recognize. He was alive. He had his original records, the discrepancy filings, the correspondence with Calloway, the chain of evidence from the Tucson end. He was the telegram said in plain and somewhat shaking hand, prepared to testify before any court that asked him to. Nora wrote back in 2 sentences, "Stay where you are. Federal protection is coming within the week." She sent the message and sat back and thought about what it meant that a frightened man in a desert mining settlement had held on long enough, had kept his records hidden, had waited in the dark, and trusted that someone was coming. Roy Calloway had known. He had counted on it. He had built a chain of people who would hold each one trusting the next all the way from Tucson to New York and back again to this narrow telegraph office in Ironfall, Arizona. He had not been wrong about any of them. It was over. Not with a confrontation in a high-ceilinged room, not with a verdict read from a bench, not with any of the formal machineries of justice that she had been trained to believe were the only legitimate instruments of accountability. It was over because three telegraph instruments in three cities had received the same information simultaneously, and because a land records clerk in hiding had kept his nerve, and because a frontier detective named Roy Calloway had spent 2 years of his life building something careful and true, and information, once it has been transmitted and witnessed and entered into the public record, cannot be recalled. Senator Silas Drummond of New York was finished. He would not know it yet. He would have a few more hours of not knowing, and then his morning would arrive, and with it the reckoning that comes to powerful men when they discover that the walls they have built around themselves are made of paper. The telegram from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington arrived on a Thursday, 6 days after the transmissions. Nora was at the table in the detective's office working on a follow-up dispatch when Edgar brought it in with the expression of a boy who has just delivered something that he suspects is important and hopes someone will confirm it. She read it. Senator Silas Drummond placed under arrest this morning on charges of wire fraud, land fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of federal proceedings. Preliminary hearing set for November 12th. Your testimony requested. Original documents required as primary evidence. Witness Theodore Marsh in federal protective custody as of yesterday. Reply soonest. She read it twice. Then she folded it once and set it down on the desk. Cade was watching her from across the room. He had been doing that more often in the past 6 days, not watching her the way he had watched her when she arrived, assessing, cataloging, deciding. Watching her the way a man watches something he has stopped being cautious about. It's done, she said. Is it what you expected, he said. She thought about it honestly. She thought about the 8 months of work, the cover identity, the train ride west, the moment on the platform when the heat had hit her and she had looked at a dust-red town and wondered what she had walked into. She thought about 3 days in a small room reading a dead man's careful handwriting. She thought about a garden lit by lanterns and a dance floor and a cabin outside of town where 3 men had told her the truth about themselves without being asked for anything in return. She thought about Gerald Fitch, who had made a choice she understood, even as it had taken something from her that she would not get back. She thought about Theodore Marsh in a mining settlement outside of Yuma, keeping his records hidden, trusting the chain. She thought about her father's name on a piece of paper that had been waiting in a sealed envelope for someone who had taken 24 years to arrive. No, she said, it's better than I expected. A week after that, the letter arrived from New York. It was from a man named Caldwell, who had recently assumed the editorship of a newly formed paper called the National Register, well-funded, editorially independent, with offices in Washington and New York. He had read her work. He knew what she had done. He was offering her the position of chief correspondent, Washington Bureau. The salary was 3 times what the Tribune had paid. The resources were, by the description in the letter, considerable. She read it at the desk in the detective's office. Cade was there. He had been there every morning for 2 weeks in a way that had moved from professional adjacency to something that neither of them had named yet, but that both of them understood, in the way you understand things that have grown so naturally you cannot identify the moment they began. She read the letter all the way through. Then she looked at it for a moment longer. Then she put it in the desk drawer. Cade said nothing. He watched her close the drawer. He watched her pick up her pen and return to the dispatch she was writing. You're not going to answer it, he said. Not today, she said. That's not the same as no. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression, the one that had started as assessment and become something she did not have a professional word for. I know a land surveyor in Tucson, she said, who can confirm the legal transfer of 240 acres in the northern section of Iron Fall, Arizona territory to a Miss Nora Voss of here, I suppose. She paused. I should go see him. Cade was quiet for a moment. I'll ride with you, he said, if you want the company. Tucson is a full day's ride, she said. I know, he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. Outside Ironfall was going about the unhurried business of a Tuesday morning, Boone carrying lumber for a widow's porch repair, Slade conducting the silent supervision of a man being very industrious with a paintbrush on the fence he had apparently agreed to paint. Edgar running a telegram to the general store. Meredith Aldridge opening her door and sweeping the same porch she swept every morning, the same motion, the same direction, the same patient regularity of a woman who has decided that if you do the small things right every day, the large things have a way of coming out tolerably. All right, Nora said, tomorrow morning. She went to the land at dusk, alone on a horse Boone had saddled without being asked, riding north out of Ironfall, on the track that became the open desert, became the long, gentle rise toward the escarpment. The last light was turning, the rock faces amber, and the sage silver, and the whole wide country was breathing itself quiet in the way it did at this hour when the day's heat released its grip and the evening moved in cool and slow from the west. The 240 acres were not marked by anything a person would notice. No fence, no sign, no boundary stone. Just a place where the ground changed slightly, where the soil deepened from red to dark red, where the grass grew thicker in the low places, where a line of cottonwoods followed the Ironfall Creek tributary in a curve that her father had probably stood beside and known was his. She dismounted. She stood on the ground. It was hers. Not in the way of conquest, not in the way of purchase, not even entirely in the way of law, though the law was coming around to agree. It was hers in the way that certain things are yours because the world has been moving towards you, owning them since before you were born, and you simply had not arrived yet. She thought about Thomas Voss, the miner who had come west with that old American faith, the faith that a man willing to work could find ground that was his and stand on it and build something from nothing. Who had signed a contract he didn't understand and lost everything and gone east and raised a daughter in a narrow apartment above a laundry and told her once near the end, write things down. Write them down exactly as they are. That's how you fight the people who change the words after the signing. She had thought he was talking about journalism. He had been talking about this. She pulled out her notebook. The new one, the one she had opened the night she decided to stay. She found the first page where she had written one line in the lamplight of the detective's office after Cade had walked away from the schoolhouse and she had stood alone with the documents of a dead man spread out on the table before her. Roy Calloway was murdered, and Cade Harlow has been waiting for someone to prove it. Below that line now, she wrote, the most important story I have ever written is this one. Not because it brought down a senator or returned stolen land or put a name to what happened to 23 families in 6 years in the Arizona Territory. Not because it vindicated Theodore Marsh, who kept his nerve in the dark, or because it gave Roy Calloway's death a meaning beyond what the territory's official record would show, but because it showed me the difference between a place where you work and a place where you belong. I have been confusing those two things for as long as I have been running. She closed the notebook. The sun went behind the Mogollon Rim. The last light left the sky in stages orange to rose to the deep translucent blue that precedes full dark, and the first stars came out, and the cottonwoods along the creek moved in the evening wind with a sound like pages turning. She heard a horse behind her. She turned. Cade Harlow sat on his horse at the edge of the land, not yet on it, waiting the way he had always waited, without pressure, without impatience, with the absolute stillness of a man who had learned that the things worth waiting for were worth waiting for completely. He had not come after her. He had followed her, which was different. He had given her the time alone that she needed, and then he had come because he had also learned to know when the time alone was over. She looked at him. Tucson tomorrow, she said. Tucson tomorrow, he said. And after that, he looked at the land around her, at the darkening sky, the first stars, the cottonwoods by the water, the long red rock of the escarpment turning black against the evening. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he intends to keep. After that, he said, "You're home, Miss Voss, whatever you decide that means." She turned back to the land. She stood on the ground that had been her father's and was now hers in the last light of a day in Arizona, in the year 1889, with the sound of the creek in the cottonwoods, and the smell of sage, and the vast quiet of the desert settling into itself for the night. And for the first time in a very long time, longer than she could precisely identify, longer perhaps than she had been running, which was longer than she had admitted, she was not thinking about where she was going next. She was thinking about where she was. Ironfall was not a beautiful town. It was a working town, a surviving town, a town that had been built from necessity in a difficult place by people who had no other options and had decided to make something from that anyway. It had dust and heat and violence, and men who decided things without asking permission, and women who had learned to navigate that in ways that cost more than they should have. It had a telegraph boy who wanted to be somewhere else, and a saloon that opened too early, and a boarding house where the punch was too sweet and the beds were just right. It also had Pearl Dunmore, who walked alone at night now. It had Meredith Aldridge, who slept. It had three men who had come here, broken, and built themselves into something better than what they were in the American way of men who refused to be defined entirely by their worst acts. And it had 240 acres of dark red soil and cottonwood trees, and the water of the Iron Fall Creek tributary, where Thomas Voss had once stood and believed in something, and where his daughter stood now and believed in something too. Not the same thing, something larger. She opened her notebook one more time. Below what she had already written, she added the last line: "I came here to find a story. I found instead the place where my story had been waiting." She closed the notebook. She put it in her coat pocket against her father's survey, both of them there against her heart. Then she turned and walked back to her horse and rode with Cade Harlow back to Ironfall, under the Arizona stars, and the desert around them was wet and dark and full of the small, alive sounds of things that knew how to live in it. And the town at the end of the track had its lamps burning, and it was waiting.